Welcome to episode 14. In this episode, we will trace some of the origins of the theory of evolution. I will give a brief overview on how the theory became popularized. By which spirit did this theory come about? Before we get into evolution specifically, though, there is one thing that I would like to touch on first that is very relevant. It is the term or the concept of biblical criticism. What exactly is biblical criticism? It's a very broad concept that comes from the even broader discipline of textual criticism. What textual criticism is the effort to examine a document within the context that it was written. Criticism meaning the thorough examination of a text. The base motivation is to accurately interpret a text in the way that it was intended for the original audience. Biblical criticism is simply this idea of textual criticism applies specifically to the Bible. The effort to understand the true meaning of the Bible in its original context is not a bad thing. However, where things start to go south, though, is that, first, we don't actually have a whole lot of knowledge of what the context actually was when the Bible was written. There are historical debates on things that happened 50 or 100 years ago. So, like, how much more unclear are events that happened 1,000 or 2,000 or 3,000 years ago? So to say for sure that we know what the context was at the times when the books of the Bible were written is a bit presumptuous. Then second, though man trying to understand the Bible is a noble cause, sometimes we can start to drift into man telling the Bible what it says, as opposed to the Bible telling man what it says. There are people out there who think that because they are called scholars and have degrees and write lots of books, they have it all figured out, and we should all listen to them instead of everybody else. And that can get a little bit concerning. So, while biblical criticism can be good, we just need to be careful that we don't start drifting into the wrong lane, so to speak. Now let's get into the theory of evolution. Charles Darwin published his famous work Origin of Species in 1859. However, the publishing of this work was more so a symbolic representation of different ideas that had been developing for many years before, as opposed to some shocking new idea that just came out of nowhere. So while Charles Darwin and his work got a lot of fame and credit, there were a lot of ideas that were swirling before that provided a launch pad for his success. The first thing to consider when thinking about the origins of the theory of evolution is the idea of uniformitarianism. Uniformitarianism is an assumption that started to gain traction well before Charles Darwin wrote The Origin of Species. What uniformitarianism is the belief that everything that we see in the present can be explained by the processes that we observe in the present. So, in regards to geology, that would mean all of the rocks that we see today would have been formed by the processes that we also observe today, like slow erosion over time and layer by layer sedimentation, and occasionally small catastrophes like volcanoes or earthquakes. So on the surface, this doesn't seem like a terribly unreasonable idea. The problem is, this stands in contrast with the Bible. The Bible's account for the history of the earth is remarkably different than the theories that these scientists were coming up with. The Bible talks about things like the creation of life and a global flood. These were single, extraordinary events that set the course of history, not things just slowly coming to be over time. One term that is used to describe these accounts of the Bible is catastrophism. This simply means that your origin story includes an extraordinary catastrophe that significantly impacted history. And that is what the Bible talks about. So, here in the late 1700s and early 1800s, there was a debate between uniformitarianism and catastrophism. The people who held to the more traditional view of the Bible would be on the catastrophist side, and the people coming up with the more modern theories would be on the uniformitarianist side. Eventually, though, uniformitarianism did take the upper hand with the elite in the Western society. I will read some quotes so that we can get a taste of what catastrophism would have sounded like before the modern era. First, I have a quote from John Woodward in 1695. Quote, Of these, the first is that these marine bodies, marine fossils, were borne forth of the sea by the universal deluge, and that upon the return of the water back from off the earth, they were left behind at land. End quote. So, that belief is pretty much the same as what I would hold to on this podcast, and also what other creation ministries do as well. So it's not like this belief just came out of nowhere recently. Another quote is from Charles Gould in 1886. Quote, "Amongst the fell destroyer both of species and of their history must have been the widespread, although not universal, inundation known as the biblical deluge, a deluge which we think the evidence given in the foregoing pages and gathered from divers nations justifies us in believing to have really taken place, and not to be, as mythologists claim, a mere ether myth. As to date, allowance made for trifling errors, there is no reason for disputing the computation of Jewish chronology, especially as that is closely confirmed by entirely independent testimony of Chinese history." Here we have an author, while not taking the Bible word for word, still believe that the evidence for a large catastrophic flood was very convincing. In this quote, we can tell that Charles Gould thought that, because of the amount of independent historical record around the globe, there must have been some kind of large flood at some point, and just dismissing these accounts as a mere myth was rather foolish. But like I said, uniformitarianism eventually gained the upper hand. Two of the biggest names that were influential in the spread of uniformitarianism are James Hutton and Charles Lyell. James Hutton published his theory in 1795 in a work called Theory of the Earth. This was an influential and foundational work for the idea of uniformitarianism. Obviously, there was many other people around him at the time who interpreted the origins of the rocks differently. However, James Hutton's work started to rise above the rest. Eventually, Charles Lyell built on and expanded James Hutton's work when he published his theory in The Principles of Geology in between 1830 and 1833. The people who were looking for an alternative theory of the Bible started to centralize around Charles Lyell's uniformitarian work. In fact, Charles Lyell saw himself to be freeing the science from the old dispensation of Moses. So from his writings, we can see that his motivation was to remove the influence of the Bible from scientific thought. In this endeavor, he found a lot of success. There were more men who contributed to this movement as well. However, they will go unnamed for now. They were kind of just a bunch of random guys. However, they have a surprisingly large impact on our lives today. So you may be wondering, where were the Christians during this time? Were they standing up for the authority of the Bible? Well, unfortunately not. As uniformitarianism became more popular within the worldly elite, the Christians were intimidated by this. So the solution to this problem started to be, instead of holding to the traditional view of what the Bible said, they started to mix these new ideas in with their teaching. In 1804, Thomas Chalmers came up with the gap theory. This was kind of the kickoff of coming up with new ways to interpret Genesis in order to fit in with the theories that were becoming popular and authoritative within the scientific community at the time. So, slowly, men started to drift from allowing the Bible to guide their thinking to themselves guiding what the Bible said. So, how is this relevant to evolution? Well, what we just talked about was uniformitarianism applied to geology. Darwin's theory of evolution was simply uniformitarianism applied to biology. So all of this work of the ideology of uniformitarianism gaining traction provided the necessary environment for it to shift into the discipline of biology. Charles Darwin just kind of published the right book at the right time. The environment for further separation from the biblical account was already there. Uniformitarianism applied to biology simply being animals changing slowly over time by basic biological processes like mutations. The unfavorable mutations dying away and the favorable mutations coming out on top. Really, this is nothing new, because people have been coming up with origin stories since the beginning of time. This modern development of uniformitarianism and evolution is really no different than any other culture coming up with their own origin story at any other point in history. In fact, there were even some Greek philosophers that believed in something kind of like evolution. They had ideas like animals coming out of the ground and slowly changing over time. So just like geological uniformitarianism, Darwinian evolution spread through the elites and displaced the theologians in science. Two big names that were influential in the popularization of Darwinian evolution were Thomas Huxley, the grandfather of Aldous Huxley, and Ernst Haeckel. Ernst Haeckel was known as Darwin's bulldog for his aggressive promotion of this new idea. Other than natural gradual departure from biblical authority in the West, there are some other, more shady factors that have contributed to the advancement of the narrative of evolution. There are multiple examples of scientific fraud being used in order to try to confirm the narrative. One example is from the man we just mentioned, Ernst Haeckel. One attribute to his legacy is that he drew fake depictions of embryos in an attempt to suggest that evolution was true. What he did was he hand drew supposed depictions of the development of embryos for different organisms, but he illustrated them in a way that made them look very similar to each other. He was trying to prove that they would have come from the same ancestor. However, the problem with this was that his depictions of embryos weren't accurate at all. He was just fabricating evidence in order to fit his beliefs. Another example of fraud is the case of the Piltdown Man. This took place in 1912. It was about this time where everybody was looking for the, quote, missing link. Great fame and fortune would come to the person who found the missing link. The missing link being a supposed connection in between apes and humans. Charles Dawson claimed to find this ape-like man. However, in 1953, it was discovered that this Piltdown Man or missing link was actually a hoax. The bones of the Piltdown Man contained a skull from a human and a jaw from an orangutan. What was called the Piltdown Man obviously wasn't a real creature, even though it took 40 years for that to be revealed. Another example of fraud is a study that was done on peppered moths. Long story short, a guy did a study on these moths in England and concluded that when tree trunks got darker because of pollution and covered with lichen, the moths would evolve to a darker color in order to avoid predators. This study was used as an example of evolution. However, the problem with this was that in his study, it was discovered later that, first of all, his experiments couldn't be repeated, but also that he manipulated the data. Here we have 3 examples from 3 different time periods of supposed evidence for evolution that were influential in pushing the narrative but ended up being fraudulent. To me, if fraud is needed to push an idea, that suggests that it maybe isn't the greatest idea. Other factors to consider when examining the influence of evolution are money and power. The way our current academic system is set up now, in order to advance your career, you pretty much just have to accept the narrative. And if you don't accept the narrative, your career will not progress, you will not get funding for research, and your access to scientific data is limited. You have to accept the narrative of evolution. There really isn't an option. And as a scientist, if you can't get funding for your research, it's kind of hard to be a scientist. A lot is done in the world of science in order to maintain and access funding. As I'm speaking now, money and political power are significant pillars that hold up the authority of the narrative of the theory of evolution. Unfortunately, this does not breed an environment where creative discovery and questioning are allowed to advance human knowledge, and that is what science actually is. Discovering the world around you, as opposed to just maintaining a forced set of ideology. Fraud, bribery, and force are not fruits of the Holy Spirit. However, they are intertwined with the narrative of evolution. But yet, many Christians still try to mix this theory into the Bible, and some of these Christians also use money in order to spread their influence and ideas. This is done by grants and influence in seminaries. If you want your ideas to spread, an effective way to do that is to increase their influence in the place where the next generation of leaders is being trained. Let me just read to you a little bit about what's going on behind the scenes. I'm going to read from a page that can be found on the website of the John Templeton Foundation, a foundation known for supporting the teaching of secular science in religious institutions. They gave a grant to something called Science for Seminaries Phase 2. I will read for you what this Science for Seminaries Phase 2 is. Quote, "The American Association for the Advancement of Science, AAAS, Program of Dialogue on Science, Ethics, and Religion, DOSER, proposes a unique suite of activities expanding the role of science in theological education. Science for Seminaries Phase 2 follows a very successful pilot project, Science for Seminaries Integrating Science into Core Theological Education. It is designed to leverage the significant interest in science engagement that we saw from nearly 40% of North American seminaries in the original project, and expand science appreciation by providing opportunities for additional seminaries to integrate science in their core curricula." End quote. Unfortunately, the science that they are talking about is not the real kind of observational science, but rather it is the ideological narrative of biological evolution and geological uniformitarianism. Those ideologies are just labeled as science. Here we have another example of money being used to propagate the narrative. Further examination of the John Templeton Foundation grant database shows countless high-dollar grants to educational institutions, both secular and religious, in order to spread John Templeton's ideas of integration of faith and science. These grants go all around the world. There are even grants to high schools. One in 2022 is called Integrating Science and Faith at Catholic High Schools Nationwide, Phase 3, given to the University of Notre Dame. They are targeting the kids. I'm sure these grants aren't all bad. However, at the core of the issue, where the problem is that the purpose is to combine secular ideology with Christianity, and that has consequences. So aside from the fraud and intellectual elitism and academic enforcement, what has the acceptance of Darwinian evolution done to our society? What are the fruits of the adoption of this ideology? Isn't it something that is taught in the Bible, or can it be simply added to the Bible, or does it really even matter at all? Well, objective observation done by honest researchers shows that the acceptance of evolution has had a negative impact on our society. We will discuss some of the fruits of this. First, in one of the most impressive books that I've come across, The Toxic War on Masculinity, author Nancy Pearcey describes how the acceptance of the theory of evolution in the late 1800s and early 1900s influenced and encouraged men to be independent, violent, commanding, and domineering. Unfortunately, this created many unstable home environments and contributed to the rise of a reactionary movement of feminism. The real toxic masculinity and the various movements of feminism have caused a great deal of pain and suffering. And, sadly, it is a fruit of the integration of the evolutionary theory in our society. Obviously, these issues are complex and there are many factors. However, the acceptance of the secular theory of evolution cannot be ignored. One may wonder, where were the Christians at the time? Well, the response of many of them was just to try to fit these theories into the Bible. Another consequence is racism. While the influence of evolution on racism can be a bit oversimplified, in fact, scientific racism existed long before Darwin's theory of evolution. However, as Stephen Jay Gould says, quote, "Biological arguments for racism may have been common before 1859, but they increased by orders of magnitude following the acceptance of the evolutionary theory." End quote. Again, it cannot be denied that the teachings of evolution at the time had a significant impact on how people viewed other people groups. In the book One Race, One Blood by Ken Ham and Charles Ware, they detail this influence. Essentially, the dominating evolutionary view for nearly 100 years was that different groups of people evolved from different kinds of monkeys at different times. For example, typically the beliefs went something like this. All white people evolved from monkeys separately, all black people evolved from monkeys separately, all Asian people evolved from monkeys separately, and usually there were some other people groups that were also considered to have evolved from monkeys separately. In fact, this is where our modern framework of race comes from. Is it really true that all people with light skin are one homogeneous group of people, or all Africans with dark skin are just one homogeneous group that can be characterized and labeled? this actually isn't reality at all. The reality is there are many diverse people groups throughout the world that are deeply interconnected and have had significant contact with each other throughout history. We will talk about this in a later episode. But, sadly, the idea that these supposed races evolved separately was held as true for many years, and that means that it was taught in schools as well. And since it was European scientists who came up with this theory, they put their own group of people, the supposed white race, at the top as the most superior and civilized. Imagine this view being taught in public schools for 100 years. It's no wonder why people were racist. Much pain and suffering has come from this idea. Another factor is religious departure. It is predictable that when truth is compromised, eventually it fades away. The University of New South Wales did a 32-year study on the religious belief of its students. In 1985, at the start of the study, about 50% of the students believed in theistic evolution, 30% of the students did not believe in God, 13% of the students believed in creationism, and 7% of the students were uncertain. In 2017, when the study was concluded, about 60% of students did not believe in God, 25% of students believed in theistic evolution, 10% of students were uncertain, and 5% of students believed in creationism. The good news is the belief in theistic evolution dropped from 50% to 25%. The bad news is atheism increased from 30% to 60%. So in just 32 years, we saw a significant decrease in the belief in theistic evolution, but a significant increase in no belief in God at all. The graph, which is shown in the sources, is actually quite striking. There's almost a direct correlation between theistic evolutionary belief and atheism. It almost looks like that theistic evolution is not a sustainable religious belief long term, and the trend is shifting more towards atheism. Belief in creationism decreased as well, but sadly this is not a surprise on how much these ideas are demonized in modern secular and religious culture. It is my observation that the desire of Satan is to have a world where everybody is spiritually and or physically dead, or at least suffering. So to me, if there is an idea that has the fruit of spiritual and physical death, destruction, and suffering, it is a bad idea, and should not be accepted, promoted, or perpetuated. Unfortunately, historically speaking, the ideology of evolution seems to have these characteristics. And that is another reason why I don't believe it should be mixed with the Bible, or accepted at all for that matter. So what then is the conclusion? The current arguments are like, yeah, sure, scientists used to be racist in the past, but we realize they are wrong now, and we're not racist anymore. And I'm like, that's great, but unfortunately, the damage is already done, and your supposed enlightened views now aren't really relevant to all the pain and suffering that happened in the past. Satan had 100 years where he could teach kids in public schools that white people were superior to other groups of people. I don't think he really cares that we don't believe that anymore, because the damage is already done. And he just moves on to the next thing anyway, that is going to cause an equal amount of death and destruction. So it's like, yeah, even though evolutionists aren't sexist and racist anymore, it's like they sure were in the past, and we are still facing the consequences of that today. People are like, what you believe about Genesis doesn't really matter. They're like, as long as you accept Jesus, it's okay to have some other secular ideology. And I'm skeptical to follow this way of thinking because, sure, maybe I can't prove that accepting secular ideology will have negative consequences 50 or 100 years from now. But what I do see is that when this was done in the past, it didn't work out too well. And many people at the time didn't really realize what they were doing. And if you would have told them to do differently, they probably wouldn't have listened, because they lacked awareness of the reality and the world around them. So even though I don't know for sure what the consequences will be of mixing pagan or secular ideologies with the Bible now, it's like I can see every time it was done in the past, and it's been bad. Like we've talked about, typically, they have characteristics of bribery, intimidation and force, death, destruction, pain, and suffering, spiritual and physical. And it's like, I don't think we should do that again. So, in my opinion, the conclusion to the matter is this. We can judge the failures of the past and think we'll never do it again. I mean, even now I'm thinking, how would people be convinced by fake drawings of embryos? Or how could a scientist get away with mixing a human skull and an orangutan jaw? Or wasn't unbiblical ideas of racism obvious at the time? And couldn't men tell that being toxic was bad? Like, surely I wouldn't have made the same mistake. But the reality is, it doesn't really matter if I'm convinced by fake hand drawings now or not, because the actual problem was in the past where people could be convinced by fake hand drawings. So it's easy to judge the past and pretend like it'll never happen again, or I wouldn't fall for it if I was there. But at the end of the day, we don't actually know what it was like to be there in the culture at that time, because it is likely that, like I just said, those people probably didn't even realize what they were doing. And the reality is, I don't think it's any different today. So the key of success to me is not necessarily elevating yourself morally above the people in the past, but being aware of the ways Satan is working in the present in order to prevent the same outcomes as the past. What are the ways that Satan is using to deceive the world right now? It's like, yes, we can learn from the ways that he's used in the past. However, what would set us apart as truly progressive is that if we were to acknowledge the bad ideas now before the blood is spilt. I think it can be done if we are willing to put forth the effort. Because even though Satan is using different wrapping paper, his end goals are the same. And irregardless of what the wrapping paper is, we can judge the spirits by their fruits. Thank you for listening, and we will see you next time.